Bicycles are a pretty handy way of getting around. They're lightweight, pretty narrow so they don't take up much space, cheap, and run on whatever it is you've eaten for breakfast, making them ideal for short-distance transport. Monorails are also a nifty way of getting from A to B. However, with all their benefits, they do come with some downsides that makes a standard rail system more ideal in the long term. So, how do you improve a monorail? Well, some folks looked at bicycles and thought that they were the answer. The first railroad to use a bicycle-style design was created by a man named Eben Moody Boynton in the 1890s. He felt that by making the locomotives taller and more narrow, he could effectively operate a double track in the same amount of space as a single, conventional railway. The locomotive he designed was driven by a single 6-foot driving wheel mounted under the boiler, with 2 more smaller wheels under the cab. The wheels were flanged on both sides to prevent them from slipping off the rails. 15 feet directly above the track was a wooden guide rail, with the locomotive having 2 sets of rubber wheels mounted on top of it set either side of the guide rail to keep it balanced upright. Hypothetically, it was believed the engine could travel at speeds of 100 miles an hour, though there doesn't seem to be any sort of record of its actual top speed. To compensate for how narrow the engine was, it was built much taller, with the cab alone having 2 levels. The passenger cars were also 2 stories tall, with each floor having 9 seating compartments. All of the doors were connected by a rod at the top and bottom, with a lever mounted so that the brakeman could open and close all the doors simultaneously. To demonstrate the design, a wooden guide rail was built over an abandoned 2-mile section of track between Gravesend and Coney Island, New York, and opened in 1890, with Boynton running services along the line. The design worked well, and as such, Boynton had 3 more locomotives built. Despite Boynton's bicycle railroad being cheaper and more compact than a regular railroad, he couldn't seem to sell his design, and as such the railroad ended up closing a mere 2 years later. I can't find any official reasons for why the design wasn't picked up, but at a guess it was likely due to the need for additional infrastructure and its lack of freight transportability. The height of the cars would have made stacking and loading goods awkward compared to a standard railroad car, and because of how narrow the cars were, this too would limit the kinds of freight that the train could carry. There do exist designs for a bicycle freight engine and goods wagons, however it's uncertain if they were ever built. Given that most money earned by railroads at the time came from freight and not passengers, it made sense that most railroads wouldn't be interested in the design. In addition, an extra platform was needed set above the one at ground level to allow people to access the second-story seats of the carriage. This, combined with the overhead rail, was likely seen as more complexity for the same results as a standard, tried and tested rail system. This, however, wasn't the end for bicycle railroads, as later, in 1910, a monorail with a similar design was built for the Pelham Park and City Island Railway, between Bartow Station and Marshall's Corner in the Bronx to replace the horse-drawn service that ran it. The main difference between this one and Boynton's railroad was the overhead guide rail, which was closer to the ground and provided power to the rail car that ran along the line. The Flying Lady, as the car was known, was the only car to run on the line, and, rather unfortunately, derailed on its maiden voyage. Nobody was seriously hurt, and the cause of the accident was put down to the railbed sinking under the weight of the car, which was carrying 100 people at the time instead of its normal capacity of 40. Because the railbed sank, the wheels on top of the car couldn't reach the guide rail, causing the car to lose balance and tip over. Despite this, the car and track were repaired and the line was reopened a few months later. The monorail only ran for 3 years, with the company running it going bankrupt just a year after it was opened. It was then taken over by the newly formed Pelham Park and City Island Railroad, who decided to replace the monorail with the standard gauge railway. Ironically, the company replaced the car with a horse-drawn tram for the first few months after its opening, before a battery-powered rail car took over. In the end, bicycle railroads did somewhat prove to be a plausible alternative to a standard railway system. However, for whatever reason, be it lack of interest, its need for more specialised infrastructure, or simply the other drawbacks of a monorail system compared to those of a normal railroad, these quirky little engines just didn't take off. Quite a shame really, because one of these engines in streamlining pulling the 20th Century Limited certainly would have been a sight to behold. In the late 1800s, a Frenchman named Charles Lartigue was in Algeria trying to figure out how to build a railway across the desert. There was a problem, however. A combination of desert winds and shifting sands would bury the rails and likely make the line unstable. What was needed was some sort of rail system that would allow the sand to blow through it. What he came up with was a monorail laid on trestles which would allow sand to freely blow through it without clogging up the line. A genius idea! So why was a monorail designed by a Frenchman to be used in a desert built in rural Ireland? In 1886, Lartigue had tested the rail system and designed the locomotives and rolling stock to run on it. The problem was he still needed to sell the idea. He came to London to demonstrate his rail system, advertising it as a cheap and modern alternative to a standard twin-railed railway. Because the rails were prefabricated, they cost much less to build, lay and maintain, and the unusual design of the locomotive and rolling stock attracted the attention of many people. Around the same time, a member of Parliament, who likely wasn't in the mood to spend money, was being contacted by Irish constituents who were lobbying for a new railway between Listowel and Ballybunion in rural Ireland. After hearing about Lartigue's cheap monorail, my guess is he just said, "Fine, here's your railway, now go away." The monorail was laid the 8.9 miles between Ballybunion and Listowel and opened in 1888, having cost £33,000 to build, significantly cheaper than a standard railway covering the same distance. It was the world's first official monorail to be used as a public service. The line could pull passengers and freight relatively well and served the local people. As you'd expect, the locals were thrilled with their new cheap state-of-the-art monorail. The Irish loved the monorail so much that around 31 years later, they went to war with the UK for independence. For starters, the coaches and trucks needed to be balanced or they'd list to one side and risk derailing. If too many people got out of one side of a carriage, then some people from the other side would have to get out and swap sides to balance it out. And if you wanted to enter the other side of the carriage, you'd have to climb over a set of steps on the carriage when the engine was stopped at a station. If a farmer wanted to take a cow to market, they'd need to take another cow or two calves as well to balance the wagon. Level crossings also had to be specially designed as the rails stood a few feet above the ground, meaning drawbridges would have to be built to allow people to cross. Some sections were built on a hinge which allowed them to swing open like a gate, but this was more fuss than necessary compared to a track laid on the ground. Conventional points couldn't be used, so sections of curved track on turntables had to be used, which were effective but awkward. And finally, the locomotive struggled to climb the incline midway along the route, sometimes necessitating passengers getting out and pushing, which wasn't helped by local youths who found it fun to rub soap on the rails. The railway was damaged in the Irish Civil War, and the government's failure to have it run by Great Southern Railways led to the line struggling for money and eventually shutting down by 1925. The carriages, engines and track were all scrapped. The problems presented by just the rails alone was enough for people to realise that it wasn't worth building a monorail over a conventional railway. A 400-metre section of monorail was built in the early 2000s by enthusiasts, with the replica of a locomotive and carriages now running as a tourist attraction in Listowel. Lartigue managed to sell his monorails in France and America too, but these also didn't last long. So for all you monorail enthusiasts out there, as quirky and fun as they are, there's a reason we don't use them instead of conventional railways. In 1876, Bradford, Pennsylvania, had become a booming oil town, and naturally many railroads wanted to establish themselves in the area to capitalize on the demand for transport of drilling equipment, oil, and passengers. The problem was the land was notoriously muddy, which often made it extremely difficult to traverse. In order to tackle the mud, the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railway felt that rather than using a conventional railway system, a monorail would be a much better solution. As it turned out, it wasn't. During the US Centennial International Exhibition of 1876, General Leroy Stone presented his monorail design as a transport solution to the people of Pennsylvania. Known as the Saddleback Monorail, Stone's design was quite similar to the Lartigue monorail, entailing a single load-bearing rail mounted on top of wooden A-frames with two additional guide rails mounted lower down on the frames on both sides. The engine and carriage straddled the rails, with the main driving wheels running along the top rail and an extra set of wheels mounted lower down running along the guide rails to help improve stability. The locomotive used a rotary steam engine instead of conventional cylinders to power its wheels, and while nowhere near as efficient as traditional cylinders, it didn't matter too much as the engine only hauled one carriage on what was essentially a demonstration line. The carriage had two levels, with seating above and either side of the load-bearing rail, and was quite ornate in its design. While not exactly a revolutionary leap in railway design, it certainly had its advantages in Pennsylvania. Because the rails were raised above as opposed to laid on the ground, the monorail wouldn't run directly over the muddy terrain. On top of that, Stone's monorail worked out significantly cheaper to build than a conventional narrow-gauge railway. As such, when building their line between Bradford and Fostertown, the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railway decided to use a modified version of Stone's monorail design instead of a conventional narrow-gauge railway. Construction began in October 1877. Piles were driven into the ground and connected via 12-foot square timbers, with the main, load-bearing rails set on top and the guide rails positioned 3 foot below. Similar to Lartigue's design, sections of rail mounted on hinges served as points, and where crossings were necessary, the line could be swung open like a gate. Nicknamed the Old Peg Leg Railway, it officially opened in 1878, totaling 4 miles in length, with each mile of track supposedly only costing $3,000 to lay. The first locomotive to be employed on the line was strange, having 2 boilers straddling either side of the central rail and having its wheels driven by a rotary engine instead of cylinders. It was described as looking like a giant pair of boots swung over a clothesline, and supposedly could run on the line at 30 miles an hour. It was also quite unreliable and quickly became worn out, and so the railway soon invested in another engine. This too had 2 boilers, but unlike the other engine, used more conventional cylinders to power its wheels instead of a rotary engine. These 2 were the only locomotives running the line for a long time, with the railway operating 10 double trips a day, pulling freight and eventually passengers, though I will say, not very well. The new engine's wheels had a tendency to ruin rails as it ran over them, causing the tracks to break during its 4th run on the line. In another accident in August 1878, the rails broke while the new engine was pulling some flatbeds out of the depot, causing 2 of the flatbeds to derail. In fact, the rails and the engines were so faulty that an accident was recorded almost daily. I can also imagine that, similar to the Lartigue monorail, passenger carriages and freight cars would have been awkward, as an even number of passengers or cargo would have to be on both sides of the cars in order to keep them balanced. Lartigue's monorail was also notorious for slipping in wet weather too, something I imagine the Bradford Railway would have suffered from given their similarities. The railway, despite its flaws, managed to carry on operating for a full year before it went out with a bang. Literally. It seems 2 new engines were ordered for the line, one from Gibbs and Sterrett and the other from Baldwin. The Gibbs and Sterrett engine arrived on the line sometime in January 1879, following a similar twin-boiler layout as the other engines on the railway. The boilers were second-hand, but had been tested before being sent off. On the 27th of January, the engine was steamed and taken for a trial run, towing a flat car carrying a handful of railway officials. During the run, one of the boilers ran dry and ended up exploding, causing the train to derail and crash into the nearby creek. Out of everyone aboard, only 3 passengers survived the incident, and it's regarded as one of the worst accidents in monorail history. The line was closed shortly afterwards, with the rails and wood swiftly being pulled up and sold off. Several attempts were made to relay the route with a conventional narrow-gauge line, but none ever made it past the planning stage. What happened to the engine built by Baldwin is unknown, but it's likely it was either scrapped or rebuilt. Whatever you want to blame it on, the fact that it wasn't a conventional railway, that the line was likely built cheaply, or that they just didn't invest enough in their locomotives, the Bradford and Fosterbrook Railway was undoubtedly a failure. Is there a timeline where the railway worked out fine in the end? Who knows? But let this be a lesson that a few rails, timbers, and strange locomotives doesn't necessarily a good railway make. During the logging boom in the US, many companies faced the problem of transporting timber from the woods to its intended destination. Many logging companies used sleds to move timber, but these were only viable in winter when the ground was much harder. Building a railroad was an option, but would have been a lot of work and expense for something that would have become useless once all surrounding trees were cut down. Steam tractors and off-road vehicles were an emerging technology, but were unreliable, couldn't transport nearly as much as a railway, and without a solid road, they'd most likely churn up the forest floor into a muddy mess, making it impossible to traverse. So what was the solution? Build a railroad, but out of logs. Most logging railroads naturally had a plentiful supply of logs that were unmarketable, and so rather than use metal rails, they'd simply lay these useless logs in a line parallel to each other. Then an engine, usually custom built, could easily run along these rails to and from its destination. Known as pole roads, these roads allowed logging companies to move much heavier loads much faster without the risk of getting bogged down, while at the same time being very low cost to build and maintain. The rails were dirt cheap to build, requiring nothing more than setting the logs on the ground an equal distance from each other and securing them in place, either with pegs or by building up a dirt foundation around them. If the line needed extending, a few more logs could be thrown down in no time. If the line needed to go in a different direction, just picking up and relaying the logs was a breeze. And then once the company was done with the line, they could either easily pull up the logs or just leave them to rot. Locomotives were custom built to run on these makeshift rails, either in a specialist locomotive works, or more commonly, one would be slapped together on site. Unlike a regular railroad, the wheels of the rolling stock were concave as opposed to just flanged. This prevented them from slipping off of or between the logs. While this did make shunting or switching more difficult, most pole roads developed their own, albeit crude ways of switching and shunting trains. These wheels also allowed the locomotives to climb steeper gradients and handle traversing the roughly laid rails, allowing the pole roads to be much more adaptable than regular railroads. They weren't without their drawbacks though. Most engines travelling on a pole road couldn't travel very fast due to the nature of their rails. On top of this, despite being able to climb steeper gradients than a regular railroad, many pole road locomotives struggled to climb uphill while carrying a heavy load, necessitating some trains to be split up to lighten the load and a very liberal amount of sand be spread over the rails to provide more traction. Despite this, pole roads were used for a surprisingly long time, right up until the end of the US logging boom. Sure, they weren't revolutionary or the next step in development for railroads, but as a temporary cobbled together solution, they more than exceeded in practicality. Nowadays, with much better off-road vehicles and a significantly smaller demand for lumber, pole roads are pretty much obsolete, but all the same, they remain as a testament to how far a little improvised engineering can go. There are many inventors one could consider ahead of their time, from Leonardo da Vinci drawing up plans for helicopters and Gatling crossbows to Nikola Tesla and all the mad stuff he was doing with electricity. For railways, one such inventor came to light in the late 1800s. But rather unusually, his idea to improve railways wasn't to make them faster or more efficient, but to turn trains into sausages. Born into a well-connected family, Josiah Vincent Meigs was an inventor for most of his life. He'd patented several small devices, designed furniture, and while serving as a Union captain during the US Civil War, he invented his own rifle. Meigs eventually moved to Massachusetts in the 1870s, where he continued inventing, and as urban passenger railways developed, especially elevated railways, he noted how much space the rails took up and how much they shadowed the streets they were built over. Meigs felt that he could do better, and so in 1872 he designed and patented his own railway system. The tracks would be supported on iron pillars and made up of 3 rails. Long girders would connect the pillars together, and on top of these girders would be 2 load-bearing rails. Between these rails would be a raised 3rd rail. This rail, however, wasn't load-bearing, so could be made out of cheaper materials such as wood. Switching would be done by mounting a section of rail on a hinged joint that could easily swing back and forth. The main wheels of the locomotive and rolling stock were set at a 45-degree angle sticking outwards, and would ride on the load-bearing rails, while an additional set of wheels mounted horizontally would grip the 3rd, non-load-bearing rail. On the locomotive, that these horizontal wheels would be powered and used to drive the train, while on the carriages they'd be used for braking. Because the rails were so narrow, they would block out less light than a standard elevated rail system, and the way the engine gripped the third rail meant it was also capable of climbing steeper gradients. Meigs spent the next few years lobbying to build an elevated railway using his system, starting the Meigs Elevated Railway Company with longtime friend Benjamin Butler, who'd become a well-known political figure. In 1882, Meigs presented his plans at the State House in Massachusetts, with crowds of people attending to see his design, so much so that spectators ended up invading the reporters' gallery just to get a view. Naturally, people were uncertain of the radical new design, but a Mr. O'Neill, representing Meigs, boldly stated that they were in an age of progress, and that what was good 25 years ago isn't good now. Meigs spent the next 3 years campaigning to build his railway, fighting multiple bills and facing stern opposition from representatives from Boston. Eventually, permission was granted for a section of track no shorter than 1 mile but no longer than 3 to be built to allow Meigs to demonstrate his design. He made some adjustments to the design and patented it again in 1885. After raising enough money, Meigs finally managed to build a 227-foot line to demonstrate his railway, opening it to the public in 1886. What he'd built looked nothing like any contemporary railway. Instead, it looked like something out of a 1950s sci-fi. To put that into perspective, this engine was built less than 3 years prior. The centre of mass for the rolling stock was focused on their wheels in order to improve stability, they had rounded bodies to help decrease wind resistance, and were surprisingly spacious for both crew and passengers. The rails themselves were laid out to demonstrate the train's ability to traverse extreme conditions, such as tight bends and steep gradients, while also being much cheaper to build than a standard railway. The locomotive had a peculiar layout, with the boiler and cab being completely enclosed and the tender being completely separate from the engine. The driver would be positioned at the front with an elevated cab to help with visibility, while the fireman was positioned at the back, presumably having to constantly go back and forth between the tender and the engine in order to shovel coal. In most drawings, the driver's cab would have had windows all around to provide a 360-degree view. However, the version that was built only had windows at the front and sides. Meigs' design also prioritised safety, with both the horizontal and diagonal wheels being fitted with brakes and a unique system where the driver could cause all of the couplings to come undone, and for all the individual carriage brakes to come on. The idea being the train would come to a safer stop in an emergency or collision if its momentum was broken up. The design wasn't just safe, but comfortable too, with the carriage provided to passengers being spacious, decadently upholstered, well lit, and with enough seating for 72 people, though it was never made clear whether the carriages were fitted with insulation or heating equipment to keep passengers warm in winter. Meigs' demonstration seemed to work, the design proving capable of not only traversing the difficult line with ease, but with speed and comfort too. Demonstrations continued until February in 1887, when the shed housing both the engine and carriage caught fire. Initial theories were that a stove being used to heat the carriage and engine to prevent them from freezing overnight had started the blaze, but Meigs and multiple neighbours suspected the fire was the result of arson, especially as the building containing all of Meigs' original models had also been set on fire. Nobody was ever caught. Despite the carriage being burnt out, the locomotive and tender survived, and so Meigs was able to continue with his demonstrations, putting temporary seats in what remained of the carriage for passengers to sit on. Meigs also wrote a book to promote his design, going into detail how a railway would operate using his system. All the publicity seemed to work, as the Lake Street Elevated Railroad in Chicago showed interest in the design, with some international interest coming from Paris, France as well. Unfortunately, at the last minute, Meigs seemed to have had the rug pulled from under him by electric competition. Not only were electric streetcars and elevated railways proving to be fast and efficient, but their use of a conventional rail layout made them much more appealing to investors. Meigs knew he could easily electrify his design, but swore by steam power, claiming it to be more economical than electric alternatives. By 1894, Meigs was done promoting his railway, and took on the job of building a conventional elevated line between Boston, Cambridge, Roxbury, Charlestown and South Boston for the Boston Elevated Railway Company. The demonstration line was dismantled while he focused on putting his ideas into practice. Meigs continued to reject electric power and the notion of building subways, insisting that steam power was more economical and the way to go, which turned away many investors. By 1896, Meigs' attempt to build the line how he wanted were fruitless, and he had to give up the endeavour, selling everything and giving up on his railway. Interestingly, it was mostly Boston representatives that had opposed his design in the first place, and now it was the Boston Elevated Railway that dominated the city. What's tragic about Meigs' design is that it genuinely had the potential to be a worthy alternative to conventional railway systems, but Meigs' inability to adapt to electricity left the idea ambitious but unappealing to investors. It's entirely possible that, despite its relative success, Meigs' design would have gone the same way as most other revolutionary railway designs that came before and after it. I suppose we'll never truly know. All we can do is close our eyes and imagine what life would have been like if Boston instead decided to settle not on standard railways, but on the Sausage Express instead. Railways are very good at moving bulk materials very fast, but their size and lack of friction between the locomotive and the rails makes them very impractical when negotiating tight bends and on uneven surfaces. Roads are good for moving stuff over uneven terrain and getting to places otherwise inaccessible by rail, but can only move a small amount of goods at one time. If only there was a way to combine the two, to be able to follow a twisting and uneven road while also having the speed and lack of friction as a railway. Born in 1826, Jean Larmanjat was a French engineer who felt he knew exactly how to get the best of both worlds when it came to road and rail. He designed a sort of hybrid monorail system, where the line would consist of a single rail laid on the ground. Rolling stock for the line would have two types of wheels: double-flanged wheels mounted in the middle of the vehicles that would ride on the rails, and two larger wheels set on either side of the locomotive and carriages. The larger wheels rested on the ground either side of the rail and were used for stability, and on the locomotive doubled as the driving wheels. The middle wheels, meanwhile, carried most of the weight to fully utilise the lack of friction between the wheels and the rails. It was essentially the middle point between road and rail. Should the locomotive require additional traction, the front wheel could be adjusted to put more or less weight on the driving wheels by means of a screw mounted at the front of the engine. A person had to be positioned at the front of the engine at all times to adjust it when necessary, making it look as if they were steering the engine, which of course they weren't. Larmanjat presented his idea at the Paris exhibition in 1867, building a short section of line and a locomotive referred to as the locomobile, garnering a positive reception. Once the exhibition was over, Larmanjat, confident in his design, opened a 5-kilometre line between Rancy and Montfermeil to further demonstrate its potential in 1868, following the public road that linked the two suburbs. Not only was the line laid cheaply, but his locomotive was able to tackle a 7% grade on the route with relative ease using nothing more than the traction it had on the road. It was also capable of travelling at speeds of 16 kilometers an hour, and negotiating tight bends much better than a locomotive of the same size. The Duke of Saldanha visited the line in 1869 at the request of Portugal's Prime Minister to gauge whether the system was worth adopting for use in urban areas. He was quite impressed by the design and wrote to the Prime Minister in favour of the railway. Saldanha felt Larmanjat's system was perfect for urban transport of goods and passengers, as the rails could be cheaply laid on existing public roads while taking up minimal space, envisioning lines connecting Lisbon to Sintra, Milhada to Viseu, Oporto to Braga, Beja, Guadiana, and so much more. Upon hearing word the Prussian government wanted possession of both Larmanjat and his railway design, Saldanha persuaded Larmanjat to work for him instead, instead. Despite his eagerness, Saldanha wasn't the first person in Portugal wanting to build one of these railways, as Manuel Feijó had proposed a line be built in 1868 using Larmanjat's system, but opposition from the government caused the plans to fall through. Once he and Larmanjat arrived in Portugal, it was decided that a short test line should be built between Lisbon and Lemaire, with Saldanha mostly paying for it out of his own pocket. Totaling 5 kilometers in length, the line was opened in 1870 with much fanfare, being quite the big event for locals. The demonstration, however, wasn't confidence-inspiring. Thanks to rain, the engine only made it 10 meters out of the station before coming to a stop, and another 10 meters before stopping again. It also seemed to struggle climbing grades despite its supposed brilliant climbing abilities. A little disconcerted but not deterred, Saldanha set out to raise money to expand the railway into the 100-kilometer urban network he envisioned. He established the Lisbon Steam Tramway Company Limited in London in 1871, taking on Edwin Clark Punchard & Company to build and run the line, and appointing Francis Trevithick, grandson of Richard Trevithick, as chief engineer. Trevithick came up with a new design for the engines that were to run on the line. Built by Sharp Stewart, the end result was essentially a standard saddle tank engine with a 1-1-2-1-1 wheel arrangement, bells, and a hydraulic cylinder at the front to increase or decrease the traction on the engine's driving wheels from the cab. Trevithick also specified that instead of running on the road, wooden planks should be laid on either side of the metal rail for the driving wheels to run on. To test the design, half a kilometre of track was built in Buckhurst Hill, Essex, where an engine could be steamed and demonstrated to the public in 1873 before being sent to Portugal. The line had grades of 1 in 18 and 1 in 22, climbs that would be very difficult for a conventional locomotive to handle. Number 2, Sintra, was chosen for the display, and impressively, not only managed to tackle the grades, but was also capable of reaching speeds of up to 20 miles an hour. Things were looking good until the next day, when it rained. In dry conditions, the line worked a treat, but once the wooden boards got wet, the wheels kept slipping, essentially rendering the engine powerless. Despite the drawback, construction of the lines from Lisbon to Torres Vedras and to Sintra were mostly completed, and so plans to use these engines continued on. By May 1873, both lines were completed and open to the public. The engines were more than capable of tackling the tight bends and grades the line followed. However, what Saldanha didn't account for were the drawbacks Larmanjat's system had. As well as the wheels slipping in wet weather, the engines were prone to derailing due to faults with the front hydraulic or obstructions like stones on the line. On rainy days, passengers would often have to get out and push while workers poured sand on the rails. Some passengers, as a result, started carrying bags of sand with them in preparation for some journeys. In dry weather, dust kicked up by the engine often got into moving parts of the locomotive, causing them to break down. For passengers, not only was the dust an issue, but so was comfort, as the carriages were quite cramped and rode poorly on the rails. Because the lines followed public roads, trains had a tendency to run down animals and pedestrians, which, combined with the derailing issue, led to the trains running at reduced speeds. As a result, trains were often delayed or ran late, with delays of up to 10 hours having been recorded. It was so bad that many people simply didn't use the tramway, despite their lack of transport alternatives. As a result, the line started losing money quickly. By July 1875, after less than 2 years in operation running at a constant loss, the tramway was finally closed and the company was liquidated. Not only had the Duke lost a considerable amount of money, but so had many company shareholders. Worse still, several people who had promoted the company were taken to court for fraud, having paid off a journalist to report favourably for the investment and dishonestly increasing the price of their shares. I'm no lawyer and it's a bit of a mess to explain, but the legal battle continued until 1894, 19 years after the railway had closed. The Duke of Saldanha passed away in 1876, and the line was quickly forgotten by the people of Portugal. The line between Rancé and Montfermeil, meanwhile, had long since been destroyed during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. Larmanjat, meanwhile, tried to sell his system elsewhere, hoping to open another line in France and possibly in Switzerland, but the faults presented by the Lisbon tramway were enough to deter people from investing in his design. He also attempted to sell the railway as a means of towing barges, managing to build a short test line, but this was abandoned after years of delays. Railways, meanwhile, were developing rapidly, and the advantages Larmanjat's design had of more traction on grades and ability to negotiate tight bends were quickly being rendered moot. In the end, while Larmanjat's railway did work to an extent, rather than giving rail vehicles more traction and road vehicles more speed and pulling power, the final product cancelled the advantages of both and left an engine that was not only weak and slow, but awkward to maintain too. Could a road rail design like this work today? Who knows? But let Larmanjat's railway act as a reminder to be careful when combining the best of both worlds, as it can often leave you with the worst of either, and that you should always properly test something before you invest in it. Wooden railways have existed for a long time, perhaps longer than the modern concept of railways themselves. Some of the first railways in the world used wooden rails, pole roads used logs to help move loads, and many bush tramways built their tracks out of timber in lieu of iron to save money. So, if you can run trains on railway tracks made of wood instead of steel with relative ease, then why not build a railway with wooden rails? Well, an attempt to build such a line happened in New Zealand in 1864, with unfavourable results. In 1862, it was discovered that the land around Lake Wakatipu in Otago, New Zealand, was rich in gold, making it a very favourable prospect for nearby provinces. One such South Island province was Invercargill, which was closely situated to the port town of Campbelltown, now known as Bluff. The province's council felt that if they were able to establish a road leading north to Otago, then Invercargill would become a bustling supply centre, bringing in goods from the port to go to the goldfields and from the fields to the port. There were, however, two major problems. Firstly was the land surrounding Invercargill was swampy and almost impossible to traverse without getting bogged down. Metal was in short supply and any roads laid with gravel were quickly lost to the swamp. Secondly, the province had little to no money, meaning that even if they could build a road, it'd leave them bankrupt. During a council meeting in 1863, Dr. James Menzies proposed a horse tramway to be the best option the province had to connect Bluff and Otago to Invercargill, but would require borrowing a significant amount of money to build. The prospect of debt on top of the lack of money the province had made most people hesitant to build a railway, until a Mr. James R. Davies proposed that instead of using iron rails, the railway could instead be made of wood. Davies had formerly been the chief engineer for the Ballarat and Geelong Railway, and explained how he designed wooden tracks for use on the line. The Australian local government had rejected the idea, but he did manage to build a short line and test it, claiming to have had satisfactory results. Naturally, everyone was skeptical of Davies' idea, so he had the locomotive he designed explicitly for use on wooden rails imported from Australia to New Zealand, had 300 metres of wooden rails laid down along the town's jetty, and demonstrated his wooden railway to the people of Invercargill. Named Lady Barclay, the engine was a 220 fitted with broad, flat wheels and two additional sets of flanged wheels set at a 45-degree angle to keep the engine from derailing. Lady Barclay garnered much attention, as it not only successfully demonstrated Davies' idea, but is debated to have been the first steam locomotive to ever run in New Zealand. The engine was also able to reach speeds of up to 25 miles an hour, and many considered the ride to be smoother and overall more pleasant than that of an engine running on metal rails. Davies followed up the trial, saying that building a wooden railway would cost less than a quarter of the price of a metal one. The engines would have more grip on wooden rails, thus improving their ability to climb grades and meaning cuts and embankments didn't need to be perfectly level, and because trees were a plentiful resource, materials to build the railway could be easily sourced as the line progressed. The rails, being made of square beams, could be rotated 90 degrees to allow the engines to run on a fresh face once one had become worn out, and even if the wooden railway failed, the line could be easily replaced with metal rails in the future. Pleased with the arrangement, the Province Council managed to raise a loan of £100,000, and construction officially began in November 1863. The line, however, wasn't as easy to build as advertised. By 1864, reports of embankments being made out of swampy earth and rails being assembled with low-quality wood was surfacing. The demand to have the line finished before winter put extra strain on the workers, and the cost of building the line ended up much higher than was expected, causing the local government to suffer financially, leading to work on the line halting by May. It took 3 months before work could start again. In the end, they only had enough money to build the line 8 miles north to Macquarie. Rolling stock for the railway was ordered from Victoria, Australia, the engines following a similar 220 Crampton design as Lady Berkeley, and by October 1864, the line was declared open, being named the Great Northern Railway, despite being at the southernmost point of the South Island of New Zealand. After a troubled construction, the railway gained further ire from the locals when the opening celebrations were announced to only be attended by railway management and other invited officials. The negative response of which led to the council organising a second, public celebration for a week later. The day before the big event, a young railway worker, Alfred Gaskett, aged 17, slipped and fell between the engine and the tender of a slow-moving train, causing him to lose his life. Trying to remain in high spirits, the celebration trains ran the next day, carrying roughly 2,000 people from Invercargill to Macquarie, where they played sports, had picnics, and generally enjoyed the sun. By mid-afternoon, it had begun raining, and soon everyone was wanting to go back home. Passengers walking to the train trod mud and clay onto the wooden rails, causing the engine's wheels to slip. And when trying to tackle a grade of 1 in 90, something it was promised to do easily, the train stalled before the engine itself finally broke down. Passengers had to either walk home in the rain, camp out at Macquarie, or try to ride on the few carriages that made it back to Invercargill. After Gaskett's death and the subsequent bitter opening, the railway practically became a joke to many locals. Trains rarely ran regularly, and it was found the engines built to run on the railway were too heavy for it. Lady Berkeley ended up having to run the line, which was not only incapable of hauling more than 10 tons at a time, but its wheels were also too wide, causing significant wear and tear on the rails. An additional engine was eventually built out of one of the Crampton's tenders and an old stationary boiler to help. Passengers who used the line were often requested to get out and help push on grades when the engine stalled, leading many to complain about the high ticket prices they had to pay for a service they had to push themselves. Ticket prices were eventually lowered, but this in turn meant the still very in-debt railway was making less money. By 1866, the railway was making half as much money as it cost to maintain, and that keeping the line open during winter would effectively mean replacing all 8 miles of track. As fond as they were of their railway, even the locals acknowledged its drawbacks, its most major being its speed. The railway gained international infamy after a Scottish woman by the name of Mrs. Steele beat it to town. The story goes, while carrying butter and eggs to sell at Invercargill Market 5 miles away, Mrs. Steele stopped at a crossing to let the train pass. The driver cheerily asked if she needed a ride, to which she retorted, "Not today, I'm in a hurry." She eventually arrived at Invercargill, sold her wares, and was enjoying a cup of tea when the train finally pulled into the station. She thought nothing more of it, but once the story reached her hometown back in Scotland, Steele became quite the folk hero, with a local newspaper publishing a short poem inspired by the event. After only a few years of service, it seemed the Great Northern Railway had learned the hard way that wooden rails weren't the solution they were hoping for. Firstly, while they were considerably cheaper to build, wooden rails had a much shorter lifespan than metal rails, wearing out significantly faster, requiring more money to be spent repairing and replacing them in the long run. Better traction than steel rails was also promised, and equally proven to be false, as wet weather and mud often caused the trains to stall on hills. Wooden rails also couldn't support the same amount of weight as metal rails, meaning there was a very tight limit on how heavy the rolling stock could be and the amount of freight or passengers that could be transported at one time. And finally, the weakness of the rails too meant that the speed at which trains could travel safely was severely limited, an issue that was made worse thanks to the Australian-built engines being too heavy for the line. As if to rub salt in the wound, by 1869 the gold rush in Otago had died down, and any hopes of extending the line further north died with it. By 1870, a traditional steel railway reached Makarewa, and Invercargill had no choice but to replace their wooden line with a metal one. The debt-riddled province at this point lost its independence, and was absorbed into the province of Otago, bringing an end to both it and its failed wooden railway. While both physically and financially disastrous, wooden railways were later commonly used throughout New Zealand, but on logging, bush tramways where the rails were only ever intended to be temporary. Permanent and mainline railways learned their lesson, and stuck to steel rails. Part of the route is still used to this day, but little is left of the original wooden line. The engines especially built for the wooden line, including Lady Berkeley, were all sold off and ended up as stationary boilers. A replica of Lady Berkeley currently resides on the Stead Street Wharf in Invercargill, while a segment of the original wooden tracks is on display at the Southland Museum. The Southern New Zealand Great Northern Railway. While I think we can all agree that, in principle, building a railway out of wood was a sound idea at the time, all it truly achieved was demonstrating to the rest of the world that sometimes the cheaper option will end up more expensive than you anticipated. The greatest problem most monorail designs need to overcome is balance. Having only one rail to work with makes it tricky to come up with a stable vehicle, as either the rolling stock needs to be over-engineered to keep it upright, or the rail needs to be bigger to allow the vehicle to gain better purchase. Both of these methods, however, have their drawbacks, which is why one engineer came up with a much more simple solution. Just give them stabilizers. In 1868, engineer William Thorold proposed an idea for a ground-level monorail system. The premise was simple: have the rail laid at ground level and mount the wheels of the rolling stock along the middle of their frames. These wheels would be double-flanged in order to keep them on the rails, and to prevent the wagons from falling over, a single large wheel would stick out on the right-hand side. This way, most of the weight was applied to the rails, granting the benefit of less rolling friction, while also gaining the ability to negotiate much tighter bends thanks to the lack of curve resistance. Fellow engineer W.J. Ewing developed the idea further in 1895, with plans to patent the design for use on construction site railways. As Ewing lived in India at the time, the design was picked up by Colonel Charles W. Bowles, a civil engineer who, in 1900, was tasked with various construction projects on the Bengal-Nagpur Railway. Bowles used Ewing's system to help move materials during the railway's construction, and found it to be ideal for the job, leading to other companies adopting Ewing's monorails for use in mines and sawmills. In 1902, the Cundale Valley Light Railway was built using this system to transport tea and other supplies for the Canaan Devan Hills Plantations Company. A cart road was initially used, but because the monorail only required one rail to work, the track could be laid along the roadway without blocking access to the rest of the road, and the balance wheel could run on the ground without the need for any special kind of paving or groundwork. With the system proving to have its merits, when Maharaja Sir Bhupinder Singh of Patiala tasked Bowles with building a railway to connect Basi with the railway at Surind, Bowles naturally proposed to build the line using the Ewing system, and Singh, being quite an extravagant man, agreed. It wasn't just the monorail's novelty that made it an appealing choice, as much of the line would follow public roads. With only one rail needed, the line could be placed at the side of the road, with the balance wheel rolling on the road, not only giving the wheel a smooth surface to run on, but also meant the rails took up a minute amount of road space. The monorail was also capable of negotiating tight bends, climbing steep grades, and cost a fraction of the price of a standard railway to build and maintain, making it ideal for passing through urban areas. Opened in 1907, the Patiala State Monorail trainways connected Surind to Morinda, as well as Patiala to Sanam, with a total of 50 miles of track laid. 75 goods wagons were built for use on the lines, along with 15 passenger carriages, with the primary source of motive power being mules and bullocks. The PSMT also had 4 locomotives built by Orenstein and Koppel for use on the Patiala-Sunam line. These 030 engines were essentially modified versions of the Orenstein and Koppel standard 060 design, with the driving wheels mounted at the centre of the axle. The wheels were double-flanged, with the middle wheel being blind to allow the engine to better handle bends. To help with balance, the right-hand water tank was slightly wider than the left, so as to lean the engine more towards the balance wheel. And because of the extra cab space this provided, the firebox door was mounted on the right side of the firebox as opposed to the rear. Despite their unusual appearance, it seems the engines worked well on the line. However, mules and bullocks seem to remain the dominant means of moving wagons. Though the primary traffic of the lines was freight, mostly agricultural produce such as wheat, they still carried a significant amount of passenger traffic. The Surind to Morinda line carrying an average of 20,000 passengers a month. Despite its seeming success, however, Ewing's monorail system still had its problems. It was noted on the Cundale Valley Light Railway that when the balance wheels of the wagons were running on the road, it made it impossible to safely pass them, necessitating the construction of passing places along the line. Despite the promised ability for the balance wheels to run over pretty much all terrain, it was found that unless the road was smooth, the wheels would shake themselves to bits, and so a smooth path would have to be maintained to ensure smooth running, somewhat negating the main benefit of the design. Having infrastructure in place to turn the wagons round too would also be necessary in order to make sure the balance wheel was on the correct side of the rail. On top of that, the double-flanged wheels would grind on tight bends, requiring more effort to pull them around the curves. Wagons had a tendency to derail on bends when travelling at speed too, meaning the monorail wasn't ideal for fast transport. The KVLR's monorail only lasted for 6 years before it was finally pulled up and replaced with a standard 2-foot narrow-gauge railway. The PSMT lasted a little longer, but its monopoly on urban goods traffic was quickly toppled by automobiles and improved roads in 1912. Whether or not it suffered from the same ailments as the KVLR isn't reported, but given that no further monorails were built using the Ewing system, it's fair to say it likely had its own issues. By the 1920s, the PSMT was in decline, and in October 1927, the line was closed. As the infrastructure was still in place, Bowles continued to experiment with the Ewing design, building a petrol-powered locomotive in 1930, but ultimately interest in the railway was long gone. Maharaja Bhupinder Singh eventually passed away in 1938 while Bowles was on leave in England. Bowles didn't have the heart to return to India, and with the government showing no interest in the monorail, it, along with most records of it, were abandoned. As the railway was given little publicity in its life, memory of it quickly faded. It wasn't until 1962, when some of the leftover rails and rolling stock were discovered in a public work department by Mike Sato, that knowledge of the railway's existence became public again. Engine number 4, along with a coach, was rescued and restored, being put on display at the National Railway Museum in New Delhi. As for the rest of the original line, little to nothing remains. Ewing's monorail system was an interesting idea. Stabilizers work on bikes after all, and in the right conditions it may be worth trying again. But given the design couldn't deliver on its promised benefits, don't expect to see it in use anytime soon. So for all those out there looking to build their own railway, make sure to remember that sticking stabilisers to rolling stock doesn't necessarily make for a merry monorail. Subscribe for more.